In the autumn of 2021, a crew of environmental surveyors working a dry stretch of the old river corridor in western Kentucky stumbled onto something that wasn't on any map. They were following a drainage survey along a limestone bluff that had partially collapsed, and one of the team members, stepping carefully along the rubble, put her foot through what looked like solid ground and felt nothing beneath it for about 3 feet before her boot hit stone. They pulled back the debris. They shone lights into the gap, and what they found below was a natural chamber, roughly the dimensions of a large living room, carved by ancient water action into the bedrock, sealed by centuries of accumulated sediment and overgrowth, and almost certainly untouched since the people who used it last sealed the entrance behind them. On the floor and shelves of that chamber, carefully arranged as though someone intended to come back for them, were 20 objects. The surveyors called the State Historic Preservation Office. The Historic Preservation Office called in a team of archaeologists from 2 universities. And over the next 4 weeks, as those archaeologists worked through the chamber with the care and precision the situation demanded, they came to understand that what they were looking at was not a random cache of abandoned belongings. This was a deliberate archive. 20 objects selected, transported, preserved, and arranged by someone who understood what they were doing and wanted it to last. The objects range in age from approximately 200 to over 2,000 years old. They come from places as far as the Yucatan and the high desert of the American Southwest. They include things that shouldn't exist in Kentucky, and things that suggest connections between cultures that mainstream archaeology has long insisted had no meaningful contact. Some of what you're about to hear has been published quietly in academic journals. Some of it is still being debated behind closed doors. And number 1, the object found deepest in the chamber in the most protected position, is the reason the lead archaeologist spent a long time sitting in silence before he said anything to anyone. Subscribe right now if you aren't already, and stay with me through all 20, because the further we go into this chamber, the harder the questions get. Number 20 was the first thing the team cataloged when they entered the grotto, and at first glance it seemed like the least remarkable of what they would eventually find. It was a stone mortar, roughly oval in shape, about 11 inches at its widest point, carved from a dense cream-colored limestone that matched the surrounding bedrock almost exactly. The pestle that went with it was still inside, resting in the bowl as though set down between uses. The interior surface showed heavy use wear, the kind of grinding polish that takes years of sustained work to accumulate. Residue analysis in the laboratory picked up traces of several plant compounds, including what appear to be dried berry pigments, a resinous substance consistent with pine sap from a species native to the Appalachian Highlands, and trace amounts of a mineral compound containing manganese that produces a deep purplish-black color when processed. This was a pigment preparation station. Someone had been grinding and blending colors here for a long time, possibly over generations if the mortar passed from hand to hand. What made it the beginning, rather than just an incidental find, was what the conservators discovered on its underside when they lifted it. Scratched into the base, faint but unmistakable, were 3 concentric circles surrounding a central dot. The same symbol appears on objects found in burial mounds along the Ohio River, at sites in southern Illinois, and in cave art contexts from Tennessee to Arkansas. Someone signed this mortar. They wanted whoever found it to know it was part of something. Number 19 was a bundle of worked antler, 12 individual pieces, each cut and shaped with clear intentionality. They ranged from about 2 inches to nearly 8 inches in length, and each had been drilled with a small hole near one end, suggesting they were originally strung together, possibly as a garment or ceremonial regalia. The antler itself, based on the species characteristics of the bone, came from white-tailed deer, which are native to the region, so there is nothing unusual about the raw material. The unusual thing was the carving. Each piece had been incised with a different pattern of lines, dots, and curved marks that the archaeologists, after weeks of comparison, could not match to any documented North American rock art or ceramic tradition they knew of. The marks are consistent in execution, suggesting either a single maker with a highly personal symbolic vocabulary or a tradition that simply hasn't been documented elsewhere yet. Possibly both are true. One researcher noted a resemblance between 2 of the symbols and characters found in the Olmec script of coastal Mexico, a comparison that generated significant skepticism, but that she stands behind. What no one disputes is that these 12 pieces were made by someone with a clear symbolic system in their head, someone for whom these marks meant specific things, and someone who wanted those meanings preserved. Number 18 was a clay tablet, roughly the size of a human palm, sun-dried rather than kiln-fired, which is the main reason it survived at all in a chamber that was dry enough to preserve it. On its face, pressed in while the clay was wet, was a detailed map, not a rough sketch. A map with clear conventions. A map made by someone who had made maps before and knew what information to include. The river system depicted on the tablet shows a main channel with 2 major tributaries, and what appear to be at least 6 significant settlements marked with small, impressed circles along the banks. The hydrologists who looked at it spent 3 days comparing it to satellite imagery and topographic surveys of the river systems of the Ohio Valley region. Their tentative identification is that the main channel represents the Cumberland River, with the tributaries being the Red River and the Barren River in what is now southern Kentucky and northern Tennessee. If they're right, this tablet was made by someone who had personally traveled or received detailed reports from the entire length of a major river system, and had the conceptual framework to translate that geographic knowledge into a 2-dimensional representation. Pre-Columbian cartography in North America is an understudied field partly because the evidence for it keeps turning up in places that challenge comfortable assumptions about what was and wasn't known before European contact. Number 17 was a length of woven textile, about 2 feet by 18 inches, folded into a tight square and wrapped in a layer of treated bark that had kept it remarkably preserved. The textile was made from plant fibers that laboratory analysis identified as a mix of stinging nettle and a grass species consistent with those found in the river bottoms of the central United States, both of which were used as fiber sources by various indigenous peoples. But the weaving technique was something else. It is a complex double weave structure, a technique that produces a reversible fabric with 2 distinct faces, and it is the same technique documented in textiles from ancient Peru, from Mesoamerican archaeological sites, and from the ancestral Pueblo cultures of the American Southwest. It is not a technique that appears commonly in the documented textile traditions of the eastern woodlands. The pattern itself, a repeating stepped diamond motif in 2 natural tones of fiber, appears in ceramic decoration traditions across the American Southwest and in Mesoamerican weaving. Whoever made this textile had either traveled or been trained in a tradition with roots far from the Kentucky River corridor. They were skilled enough that the fabric, 800 years after it was folded and wrapped, still holds its structure. Number 16 brought the team a detail they hadn't expected. It was a ceramic vessel, about the size of a large fist, with a lid fitted so precisely that it had maintained an airtight seal for what radiocarbon dating of the organic material inside would estimate at roughly 600 years. The vessel itself was made from a fine-tempered clay, with a burnished surface decorated in a style the archaeologists immediately recognized as related to the Caddo tradition, a sophisticated culture that flourished across what is now Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma, from roughly 700 to 1700 CE. Caddo pottery is some of the most distinctive and technically accomplished in pre-Columbian North America. Finding a Caddo-style vessel in western Kentucky is unusual, but not impossible. Trade networks between these regions are documented. What was inside, however, was less expected. The vessel contained a carefully preserved collection of seeds, each wrapped individually in thin strips of the same treated bark material found around the textile. The seeds have been identified as belonging to 3 species, one of which is native to the American Southeast, one of which is native to the high desert Southwest, and one of which the botanists who examined them have so far been unable to definitively identify. They are not native to Kentucky. They are not native to anywhere nearby. Someone collected these seeds from places far apart and brought them together in this small vessel as though assembling a library of living things. Number 15 was a tool, but not the kind you use with your hands. It was an astronomical instrument, or at least something that functions as one. A flat, rectangular piece of polished galena, the shiny lead sulfide mineral that outcrops in the mineral belt of southern Missouri and adjacent Illinois, about 8 inches long and 3 wide, with one edge ground to a smooth convex curve and the flat face marked with a series of notches along both long sides. The spacing of the notches is not decorative. An astronomer brought in to consult on the object spent 2 days with it and a set of solar tables before concluding that the notch spacing, read against the curved edge as a kind of shadow casting device, functions as a calendar. Specifically, it can be used to track the solstices and equinoxes with precision, and the notch intervals between them divide the solar year into 16 segments of roughly equal length. The Mayan calendar divides the year into 18 months of 20 days. The Aztec calendar uses similar divisions. 16 is not a number that appears commonly in European calendrical systems. It does appear in certain Mesoamerican counting traditions. Whether this represents independent invention, diffusion of knowledge, or something stranger, is a question the archaeologists are not yet willing to answer on the record. Number 14 is where I want to stop for a moment, because this object generated the most immediate controversy of anything in the grotto. It was a small carved medallion, about 3 inches in diameter, made from a material that analysis identified as jet, a form of fossilized wood that produces a deeply black gem-like material when polished. Jet does not occur naturally in Kentucky or anywhere in the American interior. The nearest sources of jet in North America are on the coast of British Columbia and in scattered deposits in New Mexico. The nearest sources outside North America are in northern Spain and in northern England, where jet from the Whitby coast has been used for ornamental carving since prehistoric times and was traded across Europe through the Roman period and beyond. The carving on this medallion shows a sun motif on one face and a stylized bird with spread wings on the other. Both motifs appear in multiple indigenous American traditions, but the material and the craftsmanship with which it was worked, the clean curves, the precision of the polish, the regularity of the engraved lines, has caused at least 2 researchers to suggest in private conversations, not yet in print, that this object may not be pre-Columbian at all, or may represent contact with a tradition that had access to European or Mediterranean materials. The official position remains undetermined pending further analysis. Comment below right now and tell me what you think about this one. Is this the most anomalous object in the cave, or does something else take that title for you? I genuinely want to know what you think. Number 13 was a human figure carved from wood, remarkably preserved by the dry conditions in the grotto, standing about 9 inches tall and painted with mineral pigments in red, black, and white. Wood rarely survives in archaeological contexts, which makes this figure unusual on that basis alone. But what stopped the archaeologists was the posture and the detail. The figure stands with its weight on one leg, the other slightly bent, and both arms extended forward with the palms facing up in a gesture of offering or presentation. The face is highly individualized, not a stylized generic face, but a face with specific features, a wide jaw, a prominent brow, eyes set slightly asymmetrically, as though the maker was rendering a specific person rather than a type. The paint is applied with precision, the red pigment concentrated around the face and hands, the black in a series of geometric bands across the torso, the white in a collar-like band at the throat. Pigment analysis identified the red as iron oxide, locally available, the black as manganese dioxide, also regional, the white as kaolinite clay. The choices are technically skilled and aesthetically deliberate. This is a portrait, or as close to one as can be made in 9 inches of carved wood. Whoever this person was, they mattered enough to someone that their likeness was made, painted, and placed in an archive with 19 other objects of significance. Number 12 was a copper serpent, cast rather than hammered, which immediately distinguishes it from most pre-Columbian copperwork found in the eastern woodlands, where hammering was the dominant technique for working native copper. This serpent was made by the lost wax casting method, a technique that requires a wax model, a clay mold, a heat source capable of melting copper, and considerable technical knowledge. Lost wax casting is well documented in Mesoamerica, where it was used to produce elaborate gold and copper objects for centuries before European contact. It is not documented in the pre-Columbian archaeology of the eastern woodlands to any significant degree. The serpent is about 14 inches long, coiled, with a head raised and mouth open, and its surface is covered in fine scale-like texturing that required the original wax model to be worked in extraordinary detail. The copper itself traces isotopically to the Lake Superior region, the same ancient copper source that supplied metal to cultures across the continent. Someone with access to Lake Superior copper and to the lost wax casting tradition either traveled from Mesoamerica to Kentucky or transmitted their technical knowledge across that distance. Subscribe right now if this is your first time here, because we still have 11 objects to go and they keep getting harder to explain. Number 11 was a set of pigment cakes, 8 of them, each about the size of a large grape, each a different color, each wrapped individually in a fragment of the same treated bark material that appeared elsewhere in the grotto. When the conservators unwrapped them, they found colors that ranged from deep red to brilliant turquoise to a dark purple-black to a vivid yellow. The mineral analysis was striking. The red was cinnabar, mercury sulfide, which in its natural form occurs in deposits associated with volcanic activity, and the nearest significant cinnabar deposits to Kentucky are in California and in Mexico, with smaller occurrences in Arkansas. The turquoise matched compositionally to deposits in the American Southwest, specifically the Cerrillos Hills of New Mexico, which were mined for turquoise for centuries before European contact and whose product was traded across the continent. The yellow was limonite, a hydrated iron oxide available in many locations, the most common of the 8. The purple-black was a compound the laboratory identified as a mixture of manganese dioxide and carbon, consistent with recipes documented in Mesoamerican pigment traditions. These 8 cakes were not assembled from local materials. They were assembled from across a continent and possibly from beyond it. Number 10 was a pipe, and pipes in pre-Columbian North America are never simple objects. This one was carved from catlinite, the sacred red pipestone from the quarries in what is now Minnesota, in the shape of a kneeling human figure. The bowl set into the figure's back, and the stem hole running through the body from the base of the spine to the mouth. The figure is heavily stylized but clearly human, with a round head, simplified limbs, and a posture of submission or supplication, kneeling with the head bowed. Catlinite pipes are documented across a wide geographic range, because the quarries where catlinite is found were considered neutral sacred ground by many different peoples, a place where enemies could meet, and where the stone itself carried a kind of pan-cultural spiritual authority. But the specific form of this pipe, the kneeling figure, the particular placement of the bowl and stem, most closely resembles pipe forms documented in the Prairie Peninsula region, the grassland corridor that runs through Iowa and Illinois into Indiana and western Ohio. What it's doing in a sealed grotto in western Kentucky, alongside pigments from Mexico and cast copper serpents, is part of the larger question this chamber keeps asking. Number 9 was a shell mask. A large marine whelk shell, the kind sourced from the Gulf of Mexico, had been cut and shaped into a face, the natural curves of the shell used to create the contours of forehead and cheek, holes cut for eyes and mouth, and the entire surface incised with a pattern of concentric lines radiating outward from the eye holes like rays of light or tears, a motif that appears in the iconography of the southeastern ceremonial complex and in Mesoamerican depictions of solar deities. The mask is about 8 inches across and would fit, uncomfortably, over an adult human face. It was found propped against the chamber wall in a position that the archaeologists initially thought was accidental, until they noticed that the eye holes, when the mask was in its resting position, were oriented directly toward the eastern wall of the chamber. Something was mounted on that eastern wall once, possibly something that has since decomposed. The shell mask was looking at whatever it was for the entire duration of its time in the dark. Number 8 was the most technically unexpected object in the grotto. It was a glass bead, a single one, about ½ an inch in diameter, deep cobalt blue, found in the sediment beneath where a larger organic object had rested and presumably decomposed. The bead had rolled to the edge of the chamber and been partially covered by sediment. Its color and composition, tested by X-ray fluorescence analysis, identified it as soda lime glass with a cobalt colorant, consistent with glass production traditions of either Mesoamerican or, more controversially, Mediterranean origin. Pre-Columbian glass beads of this type have been found at a small number of North American archaeological sites and remain among the most contested categories of evidence for pre-Columbian contact with non-indigenous populations. The official position in most academic contexts is that such beads represent early post-contact intrusions into pre-contact contexts, accidentally mixed into older archaeological layers. The context here complicates that explanation. This bead was in a sealed chamber. There was no early post-contact intrusion. Whatever the bead is, it got there by a path that someone has not yet adequately explained. Leave a comment below right now and tell me your theory on this one, because the comment section on this video is going to be interesting. Number 7 was a set of 4 engraved bones, each about 5 inches long, made from the long bones of a large bird, most likely a trumpeter swan based on the dimensions. They had been cleaned, dried, and then incised with images that cover nearly their entire surfaces. Each bone depicts a different scene. The first shows a figure in elaborate headdress standing before what appears to be a large structure, possibly a temple mound. The second shows a canoe with multiple figures crossing a body of water under a sun symbol. The third depicts a series of animals in procession, including what appear to be a bear, a deer, a serpent, and an animal with long ears that might be a rabbit or a dog. The fourth is different from the other 3. It shows no figures at all. It is covered entirely with a grid of small, incised marks, arranged in rows with varying numbers of marks per row, that at least one researcher has suggested may be a tally system or numerical record. The other 3 bones tell stories. The fourth bone records something. Together they function like pages of something larger, a book that was made from the bones of a bird that was itself probably significant to whoever made it. Number 6 was a disc of pure gold, 2 inches in diameter, beaten thin, and stamped on one face with a design showing a stepped pyramid with a circular element above it, suggesting the sun. Gold does not occur naturally in Kentucky or in any adjacent state. The nearest natural gold deposits to western Kentucky are in the Black Hills of South Dakota and in the southern Appalachians of Georgia and North Carolina. Gold working in pre-Columbian North America is documented primarily in 2 contexts. First, in the Circum-Caribbean and Mesoamerican cultures, where it was extensively worked in lost wax casting and hammering. And second, in a limited number of objects found in southeastern ceremonial complex contexts that are themselves suspected to reflect Mesoamerican influence. This disc is the kind of object that a scholar finds and either publishes very carefully with extensive qualification or doesn't publish at all, because the question it asks is one that the existing framework of North American pre-Columbian archaeology does not have a comfortable way to answer. It is in a sealed underground chamber in Kentucky, with 19 other objects that ask the same question from 19 different angles. Number 5 was a bound sheaf of plant material, about 18 inches long, tied with cord at 3 points along its length. The binding cord was made from agave fiber, a plant not native to Kentucky or anywhere in the eastern United States, native instead to arid and semi-arid environments from the American Southwest through Mexico and into Central America. When the sheaf was carefully opened in laboratory conditions, it contained 37 individual plant specimens, each of a different species, each dried and pressed flat in a way that preserves both the physical structure and, in most cases, enough material for identification. Of the 37 specimens, 22 have been identified. Of those 22, 14 are native to the American Southeast and are the kinds of plants one would expect to find in a Kentucky context. The remaining 8 are more remarkable. 3 are native to the American Southwest. 2 are native to Mexico. 2 are native to Central America. 1 is a species that the botanist who examined it has so far been unable to place in any North American context at all, and is currently running comparisons against herbarium specimens from South America. This sheaf is an herbarium, a deliberate collection of plants from a wide geographic range, assembled by someone who traveled or who received specimens from those who did, and who thought that preserving this botanical record was important enough to include it in an underground archive. Number 4 was a painted hide, roughly 2 feet square, rolled and wrapped in the same treated bark material seen elsewhere in the grotto. The hide itself appears to be deer, tanned using a technique that has preserved it in remarkable condition. On its painted surface, in mineral pigments of red, black, white, and a faded green, is a cosmological diagram. At the center is a human figure standing with arms outstretched. Around it are 4 quadrants, each containing different imagery. The quadrant corresponding to what the diagram seems to designate as east contains a sun symbol and a bird. The west quadrant contains a serpent and what may be a cave or underworld symbol. The north quadrant has an animal figure that appears to be a bear and a series of dots that one astronomer identified as a representation of the Big Dipper. The south quadrant shows water, plants, and a smaller human figure. This is a map of the world as understood by whoever made it, not a geographic map, but a conceptual one, a diagram of the relationships between the human, the natural, the celestial, and whatever lies beyond. Similar cosmological diagrams exist in the iconographic traditions of dozens of pre-Columbian cultures across the Americas. This one, with its specific combination of symbols and quadrant organization, does not precisely match any one tradition, but draws recognizably from several. Number 3 was a carved wooden staff, about 4 feet long, made from a dense hardwood that the dendrochronologists identified as black locust, which is native to the Appalachian region and has the distinction of being one of the hardest and most rot-resistant of North American woods. The staff had survived in the dry chamber in reasonable condition, though the surface showed checking and some cracking from centuries of temperature variation. What made it remarkable was the carving along its entire length, a continuous spiral that winds from base to tip, and within the spiral, carved in low relief, a series of figures that tell what appears to be a sequential narrative. A human figure appearing multiple times in different postures, animals in various configurations, a recurring sun symbol that changes position relative to the other elements in what might be a way of marking time. The archaeologist who spent the most time with this staff described it as a story that you hold in your hands and turn to read, the rotation of the staff revealing the next scene in the sequence. She counted at least 40 distinct scene units in the spiral, more than enough for a substantial narrative. The story it tells has not been translated. The tradition it comes from has not been identified. But it is clearly a story, made by someone who thought in narrative and wanted their narrative to travel. Number 2 was the last object cataloged before the team reached the deepest recess of the chamber. It was a spherical stone, about the size of a baseball, made from a dark green material with a slight luster that laboratory analysis identified as serpentinite. Serpentinite occurs in zones of tectonic contact, where oceanic and continental plates have collided, and the nearest exposures to western Kentucky are in the Appalachian mountain chain to the east. The stone had been worked into a nearly perfect sphere, and the surface was covered with engraved lines that form a continuous geometric pattern wrapping around the entire circumference, so that no matter which way you orient the sphere, you are always in the middle of the pattern. The lines form a network of interlocking angular shapes that one mathematician described as topologically consistent with the projection of a three-dimensional lattice onto a curved surface, a way of mapping a spatial structure onto a sphere. Whether this is what the maker intended, or whether the pattern is symbolic rather than geometric in purpose, is something the researchers are still debating. What they agree on is that it required exceptional planning. You cannot engrave a continuous pattern onto a sphere without knowing, from the very first line, exactly where every subsequent line will go. This was made by someone who could hold a complete three-dimensional design in their mind and execute it without error. And now we reach number 1. The lead archaeologist on this project has described what he found at the back of that chamber in a way that I have been thinking about since he told me. He said it was like finding a letter that had been waiting. This is what was there. At the deepest, most protected point of the grotto, resting on a natural stone shelf that the water action had carved into the wall at roughly shoulder height, wrapped in layer after layer of material, the outermost being a clay casing sealed with resin, the next being several thicknesses of the treated bark that appeared throughout the chamber, the inner wrapping being sheets of hammered copper fitted together like armor plate around what they protected, was a bundle. The conservators spent 3 days opening it under controlled conditions. Inside the copper was a cylinder of worked bone, about 8 inches long and 4 inches in diameter, capped at both ends with fitted discs of the same serpentinite as the sphere from Object 2. The cylinder unscrewed. Inside it were scrolls, 41 of them, each about 8 inches long and 4 inches wide when unrolled, made from a material that analysis has identified as treated fish bladder. a preparation method documented in certain Pacific Northwest traditions for making a thin, durable, semi-transparent writing surface. The fish bladder was prepared, dried, and then written on with a fine instrument in a dark pigment. Each scroll contains writing. The writing system is consistent with what was found on Object 4, suggesting the same hand or the same tradition. The scrolls appear to be a continuous document, organized into sections, with repeated elements that might be headings or divisions. The content has not been deciphered, but the structure of it, the variation in what appears to be sentence length, the presence of what look like lists interspersed with denser text, the consistent organization across all 41 scrolls, makes clear that this is a sustained work of some kind, not a tally or a record of transactions, something that required extended thought and deliberate organization, a work of knowledge. The lead archaeologist sat quietly for a long time before he said anything to his team. He told me later that what silenced him was not the strangeness of the object, it was the familiarity of the impulse. Somewhere, a long time ago, in a tradition we don't have a name for, someone sat down for a long time and wrote. They wrote carefully, over what must have been many sessions. They organized what they knew and what they thought and what they had seen. And then they wrapped it in the most protective materials they could find and put it in the deepest, most sheltered place they knew. They were trying to make sure it lasted. They were trying to make sure it would be found. You are the person who was supposed to find it. Think about what these 20 objects, taken together, actually represent. A pigment station used for generations. A map of a river system. A textile woven in a technique from a tradition 1,000 miles away. Seeds from 3 different climate zones carried to a single small vessel. An astronomical calendar. A medallion made from a material that has no natural source within 1,000 miles. A glass bead in a sealed chamber. 41 scrolls of writing in an undeciphered language, protected like something that had to survive. This is not a random collection. This is the work of people who were connected, curious, mobile, and serious about knowledge. People who thought about what they knew and wanted it preserved. The next time someone tells you that the pre-Columbian world of North America was a patchwork of isolated, simple communities with no knowledge of each other and no knowledge of the world beyond their horizon, think about the grotto. Think about the scrolls in the fish bladder cylinders inside the copper casing inside the bark inside the clay, in a dry chamber beneath a Kentucky bluff, waiting. Drop a comment right now and tell me which of these 20 objects changed something for you, which one you're still thinking about. That conversation in the comments is one of the main reasons I make these videos, and I read every single one. If you're not subscribed, do it now. Share this with one person who thinks they already know everything about American history, and I'll see you in the next one.